Okay, well, hello again. Thanks a lot for your patience and thank you for joining today's webinar, which will focus on the role of REDD+ and aviation. We have about 50 attendees on the webinar. We might have a few more by phone. So please note that everybody has been muted automatically, apart from the panelists, apart from the speakers. However, we have allocated time at the end of this webinar for a Q&A session, and we'd like to encourage you all to submit your questions in writing at the bottom of your page, where you will see a little folder called chat, and if you submit your questions in that table called chat, the questions will be shared with the organisers, IETA and CMIA, as well as the panellists. So maybe throughout the webinar, if you have questions, please feel free to submit them in writing in the chat. Well, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the joint host of this webinar, Richard Folland from CMIA, and I will take over for the Q&A session towards the end. So Richard, maybe you could take us through what we will be discussing today.
Sarah, thank you very much, and good afternoon or good morning to you wherever you are. And just to say, I'm based here in London, and we are all still somewhat reeling from the Brexit vote last week, which is going to have all sorts of implications, not least we expect both for UK and for European climate and energy policy, perhaps internationally as well. We will see. But we have this very important subject today on the webinar at hand of REDD+ and the aviation sector, and I'll just very briefly describe how we're going to run this. We will first have 3 speakers, one talking about ICAO, one moving to the REDD+ side of things, and then the third speaker will talk about the key question of whether the aviation sector would be a good fit, the sorts of demand for REDD+ credits. And we will then have a couple of commentators. So the speakers will be speaking for 10 minutes each with slides, and then our commentators 5 minutes each, and then, as Sarah said, we'll then move to Q&A. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Chris Surgener, and Chris is the editor of Green Air Online, which covers aviation and environment issues, and Chris is going to speak to us for 10 minutes on whether ICAO can deliver a global market-based mechanism at its triennial assembly in September. Chris, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Richard, and thank you for having me, and hello, everybody. Before I answer this question, can ICAO deliver, let me just sort of put it into a bit of a context. What is ICAO? What are we trying to achieve here? And then we'll get on to the point of can it deliver on this scheme that it's trying to reach. So if I could have my first slide, please. So if we just briefly go through some of the timelines that it's taken for us to get where we are, as you can see, it's quite a long time since ICAO was given the responsibility to address.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
To address greenhouse gas emissions from international aviation. And it's important to stress at this point that we are talking about international aviation emissions and not the global total. Domestic aviation emissions are actually covered under NDCs. So international aviation emissions cover approximately 62% of the total global. So ICAO itself is a UN agency with 191 member states. It's governed by the ICAO Council, which is an important body comprising 36 member states, and they get elected after each assembly. And the assembly is held every 3 years, so the last assembly was back in 2013. Back in 1999, the IPC produced a landmark report report, and at the following assembly, as a matter of urgency, so we're going back 15 years, the assembly at that year endorsed the development of an open emissions trading system for international aviation. But nothing really transpired until 2010, when the 37th Assembly adopted as a global aspirational goal an already target set by the aviation industry of carbon neutral growth from 2020. And then at the last Assembly in 2013, the Assembly decided to develop a global market-based measure scheme based on carbon offsetting for a decision by the 39th Assembly, which, as you can see, is coming up at the end of September. And as part of a basket of measures, ICAO and the industry do not see the MBM as on its own. It is part of a basket of measures that include technology, infrastructure improvements, and the development of alternative fuels. And so it's also important to recognize that this scheme is seen as a temporary gap filler. That's how they describe it. A matter of opinion whether it's a temporary gap filler or whether in fact it will continue for quite some time to come. So let me now move on to the next slide, please. As is typical at ICAO, they like to set up these groups. So after the last assembly, they set up the Environment Advisory Group to kind of oversee the development of this scheme and focus on the policy aspects. As we've gone on, we've seen another group set up more recently called a high-level group to assist the Council in developing the Assembly resolution, which essentially outlines its scheme. Also, after the last Assembly, a technical group was sort of set up called the Global Market-Based Measure Task Force, which had two main subgroups which have been continuing their work. One is concentrating on the MRV, and another group looking at carbon offset eligibility criteria. And I would imagine representatives from IETA and other such groups are sort of part of this task force. Also, after the Assembly, they came up with a framework proposal for a scheme to be kicked around and discussed by the EAG and others. And then over the last 3 years, we've had a series of what they call GLADs, Global Aviation Dialogues, held in the various ICAO regions to update member states and stakeholders on the development and design elements of this scheme and to get feedback. I think it was an important thinking behind this, that in previous times stakeholders weren't necessarily invited to take part in this, and quite a lot of things happened behind closed doors. And then we go on to last month. A high-level meeting took place in Montreal with 65 states to try and reach consensus on this draft resolution, which has the design principles of this scheme. So let's now move on to the scheme itself. The next slide, please. So CORSIA, that's the current name for this scheme. I think it's called the Carbon Offsetting Reduction and whatever, International Aviation Emissions. And this is designed, going back to this temporary gap filler measure, to end in 2035, that has a periodic 3-year reviews starting from 2022. And these 3-year reviews are quite important in the sense of hopefully they will lead to a ratcheting up of ambition in line with progress on the Paris Agreement goals, and it also allows for a review at the end of 2032 for an extension should it be required. We then sort of go to kind of the meat of it. It's due to start with a 2-phased implementation, first from 2021, second from 2026. And this is really to accommodate what we call the special circumstances and respective capabilities of developing states. Most people will be familiar with the term common but differentiated responsibilities. And this is really where a lot of the main areas of contention are coming into why this scheme is where it's at, which is still a long way from being completed. The idea is that in the first phase, it should cover around about 80% of international aviation emissions, depending on the number of states that are included in this. And this, as I say, is still up for grabs a bit. It's based on a share of international aviation activities, or what we call RTKs. But there are some discussions about how you define an RTK, and a lot of these definitions are still to be worked out. So around about 1%, if you have if you're a state with 1%, above 1% of the total share, then you start in phase 1, above 0.5% from phase 2. And then there is a second criteria, which has been going through, which is based on a state's GNI per capita. But this was rejected at the high-level meeting last month, and a new economic criteria is required. There was also discussed at the HLM a pre-implementation or pilot phase, which could, in theory, perhaps delay the start of the scheme, but actually at this point nobody really wants it. Also exempted from the scheme are LDCs, SIDS, and landlocked developing countries, unless they meet the above criteria. Having said all this, all excluded states are strongly encouraged to take part. And then we have another series of exemptions. So if you are, if you have a country that's in the scheme and a country outside the scheme, then routes between those two countries, all emissions are exempted from that. So, for example, a flight from London to Barbados, all flights would not be covered by this scheme. So as you can see, there are a creeping number of exemptions taking place in this. Another area of contention is how you divide up the responsibilities. At the moment, we talk about this sectoral growth. So in other words, we look at the overall picture. So an operator's requirement will be based on the sectoral growth rather than that airline's individual growth. Another proposal came in at the HLM from the United States, which they call the dynamic approach, where it transitions over time from a sectoral to an individual growth.
Hi, Chris. Just to say, you'll need to wrap up in a moment.
Okay, all right. So as you can see, there's quite a lot still to come. In terms of credits and so on, this will not be decided really until the next triennium, the next 3-year process. So nothing will be decided on REDD Plus or anything like that until the next couple, 2017, 2018 perhaps. So to my last slide, just as a parting shot, just to look at what the market might be sort of looking at in terms of the emissions to be offset. This is an ICAO graph. By 2025, you can see that the requirement should be somewhere in the region of 142 to 174 million tons of offsets, rising to 2035, 443 to 596. What that might mean for REDD, I point you to a report by the Stockholm Environment Institute, which seems to think that you could possibly add another 2.5 gigatons of offsets during the course of that 2020-2035 period. So at that point I will stop. If there are any questions, obviously I'm here to help. So back to you, Richard.
Chris, thanks very much indeed. That was very clear. And just, I'm not sure if the line was open for everybody at the start. So just to, if you missed the introduction, that was Chris Surgener of Green Air Online. I'm Richard Folland from Climate Markets and Investment Association, and I'm co-chairing this seminar with Sarah de Block of IETA. So now, with great pleasure, I'm going to hand over to David Antonioli of the Verified Carbon Standard, VCS. David is CEO there, and David's going to look at it from the REDD Plus perspective and whether REDD Plus credits can be a realistic source of supply for the aviation sector. David, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks a lot to IETA and to CMA for organizing and for inviting me to speak. Yes, I wanted to speak first about, just to make sure that we're all clear on what the definition is. So if I could have the next slide, please, in terms of what the, how UN defines REDD Plus. We're looking at both the typical types of projects we think typically when we consider REDD Plus, which are reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, but this also includes afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation activities, as well as improved forest management. So I wanted to make sure that we're all clear in terms of what REDD Plus really means when we consider what we're talking about. If I could get the next slide, please. I wanted to talk about why we think REDD is an important source of credits that can help the aviation sector meet its obligations while delivering real reductions and ensuring environmental integrity. I think the first point relates to the fact that many of the technical or analytical challenges of the past have been resolved. The first one being non-permanence. For a long time, people felt that or considered that the fact that you're going to save a forest and that the trees could eventually get cut down, or that carbon stored in those trees could go up into the atmosphere, was a real problem. And people tried to figure this out for a long time. The CDM took the approach of delivering temporary credits, which really didn't work. But in the voluntary market, and now we're seeing in compliance markets like in California, we're now taking a different approach, which was pioneered by a number of different organizations, including ourselves, whereby you take a certain percentage of the reductions that are achieved, you set them aside into an insurance buffer or buffer pool, and that serves to ensure that the credits that are issued and transacted in the market are permanent. And this really is I think the solution that we've come up with. So in many ways, the idea of non-permanence is really a non-issue anymore for now, and we think has really been addressed to a large extent. The second one relates to leakage, and that's the idea that if you protect a certain area of forests, that the drivers of deforestation will move elsewhere. And again, I think the voluntary market in particular has done a lot in terms of addressing some of those concerns, or most of those concerns. In the end of the day, once we get to national and jurisdictional level programs, that will be addressed directly. There will be comprehensive accounting for all of emission reductions. There will be harmonized accounting with projects operating within jurisdictions. I think it's worth noting that even at the project level, much work has been done to address leakage, mostly because projects properly designed are effectively taking into account the drivers of deforestation so that they're incorporated and addressed within the design of the project. And even when that doesn't happen, there's discounting that happens. So again, one of the big challenges to REDD in the early days was leakage, and I think to a large extent that's been addressed and will be addressed certainly as we move towards jurisdictional programs. So overall, we think that environmental integrity has been demonstrated, and we now today have credits, and we'll have in the future credits that are fully fungible with other credits in the market, so they're perfectly equal, and that makes for more liquidity in the market and allows REDD Plus credits to play an important role. Another important reason we think REDD should be considered is that these are potentially large-scale reductions that will be able to deliver low-cost abatement to the aviation sector, and I think that's a pretty important consideration, particularly considering that going forward, our understanding is that the supply of credits will probably be limited as we see more implementation of carbon reduction programs around the world as part of the NDCs, but also as part of the requirement under the Paris Agreement to require addressing double counting or ensuring that there are no double counting provisions throughout the system, which will essentially, I think, limit the volume of credits coming from developing countries. A third reason is that these projects are geographically diverse. REDD is located in countries with great forest resources, and those countries are often not industrialized, and they've not been able to benefit from the resources delivered through the CDM. In many cases, some of the least developed countries in Africa, in Asia, have been left behind under the CDM, and REDD is a great opportunity for them to be able to harness some international financing for forest protection and environmental protection generally. The other one is that, REDD dovetails nicely with aviation and the story and the narrative behind aviation. Airlines, and many of them already, and I think Michael will speak to this a little bit, but airlines really like the idea of REDD because, they are helping to protect the forest, possibly or more likely in a country where they have flights going to or coming from, and that can be a really nice narrative. There's a link here. I'm not sure if you guys can click it, but there's a nice a piece that we, along with 8 other large international NGOs, put together, looking at and advocating for REDD within the context of the MBM. And folks can have that for reference if they want to look at that. And I think the other really important piece about REDD is that it delivers significant and important non-carbon benefits. If I can have the next slide, these are a couple of images. These are, which I think are really important. If I can get the next one. This might be hard to see, but this is really one of my favorite slides. And this, not yet. The kids, no, can you hold on? Don't click yet. If you can go back a little bit. But on the background there, you see this is a photo of a community meeting in Papua New Guinea where 5 communities were getting together and voting on what to do with the revenues from the REDD project. If you can see, it may be hard to see, but the first column there says education, the second one says health, the third one says community benefit, and there's a couple of others. But you can see that education and health are really the top priorities, and what these communities are dedicating their REDD revenues towards. So it's pretty important, I think, to illustrate that today REDD has a very important community-based element to it, which we think is really critical to delivering kind of those sustainable development benefits that these projects can deliver. If you go to the next one now, we'll see our kids from Africa. This is a project that is actually investing in education, and these are kids in Africa. They're benefiting from that. If I can get the next one, please. This is a project that's helping a community live and will have more sustainable agricultural systems around a forest so that they can live sustainably with the forest. If I get the next one, please. This should be a ranger in Africa overlooking nice forested land. Again, part of a REDD project. Next one, please. This is a rubber tapper in Guatemala who now has a job because this area has now been has trees that are producing rubber, and it used to be a degraded land, so now it's been forested, and so you have sustainable development livelihoods being generated as part of this project. And the last one is a project from Indonesia that protects wild orangutans. So this, I think, project was a project that was slated to become a palm oil concession or a timber concession. So, but now it's been protected to become to ensure that the habitat for orangutans is preserved. So it's pretty important stuff that goes beyond even just the emission of reductions, although clearly that's what we're after. If I can get the next one, please. What we've seen in the voluntary market, which really has been the testing ground for REDD in many ways, has been that forest projects have been increasingly important and have been generating a lot of confidence among voluntary buyers. And you see in this slide, which is a graph from the Ecosystem Marketplace reports. This is last year's report that was describing how REDD projects and forestry projects have become increasingly important. And in 2013 and 2014, they were the major credits that were transacted in the voluntary market. Last year was a little different story. Wind and renewables took over, but still REDD was, and forestry projects were still critical. If I can get the next one, please. This is the graph from the last year's report. And so actually the colors got switched around, but the light blue in the new graph on the right is renewables, and the dark blue is REDD and forestry. Thank you. If I can go on to the next one, please. Just some parting thoughts.
David, just a second. I'm going to have to ask you to finish up in a moment, if that's all right.
Yep, this is my last slide. So just some food for thought for the discussion. The first one is that the Paris Agreement could limit supply. As I mentioned before, the INDCs, and there will soon be NDCs, will be, we hope, delivering policies, programs, and efforts to reduce carbon emissions around the world. And that means that many of the projects that are currently in existence will either be subsumed into those programs and will therefore not be able to generate credits. And of course, the double counting rules set out under the Paris Agreement will be critical to ensuring that there's no double counting, which again, because there's now essentially what I would call a bit of a shadow price on carbon in developing countries and throughout the world, those credits or those reductions now have a value. And so countries are going to think twice about letting credits be exported. So there will be I think that there will be a limited, a constraint on supply. Next one, please. The other thinking that we wanted to share was that early action phase, I think you called that as a pre-implementation phase, Chris, is very important. We think that allowing airlines to purchase credits and retire them prior to 2020 will be very important so that they can generate experience and familiarity with credit trading. It'll also give the market time to ramp up and adjust. It's not, you can't just show up in 2020 and flip a switch and expect the market to deliver all the credits that it will need. It'll need some time to adjust and to make investments and to deliver the credits and to develop a pipeline. So we think that this timing is really important. And I think what's also important that make sure that the new market leverages all the existing work that's out there. There's a whole bunch of projects out there that are operational and ready to deliver credits, and I think it would be a real important to be able to leverage that expertise. And the final thought, the last one please, relates to the fact that airlines are commercial entities. And I think, a lot of times we think about what they will be looking for, and we think about REDD and other credits, but in the end of the day, the airlines will want to buy credits from those who can deliver, who can guarantee delivery, and this will drive efficiencies in common in market mechanisms, much like we had under the CDM and under the voluntary carbon market. We'll probably end up seeing delivery guarantees, new financial instruments. And I think this will be very important to consider as we go forward in thinking about the kinds of credits that will be needed for this market to evolve and to succeed. Thank you.
David, that was excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Just before I go to our next speaker, just to remind those of you who are online that you can submit questions now, and Sarah will pick those up for when we go to the Q&A. So now I turn to the industry, to Michael Schneider from IATA, and Michael's going to have a look at this question of is the aviation sector and REDD Plus a good fit? Would it be a source of demand for REDD Plus credits? Michael, over to you, please.
Thank you, Richard, for the nice introduction, and thank you for having me here to represent the industry. IATA talks on behalf of 260 plus airlines, and we're covering approximately 86% of the global traffic. If we could maybe move on to the first slide. We have heard from Richard, not from Richard, from our first presenter, Chris, sorry, Chris, about more the theoretical part or the technical side of the IQ discussions, and I would like to maybe present a little bit sort of what's happening on an everyday basis and what's actually happening, and in the future how we see maybe airlines investing in REDD credits. And before doing so, I just wanted to start maybe casting our mind back and where we're coming from. Obviously, everything started with a vision somehow. Our vision is carbon neutral growth, then also leading to a zero carbon emission future. I mentioned it always beforehand, have done so many times before. We are not carbon market experts. We are not project developers, but we are in the business of flying planes, and we're pretty good in that. We can demonstrate impressive numbers. I mean, transporting on a daily basis 10 million passengers, conducting more than 100,000 flights. But we also should understand that we're a growing sector, and we're growing approximately 4.5% per annum over the next 20 years. And if we move on to the next slide, if the sector wants to grow in a sustainable manner, obviously we have to have some very good measures in place. And I believe Chris mentioned already the basket of measures, which I will also very briefly touch upon because they are an important part of our overall strategy. So basically our vision translates in 3 ambitious goals. And if we move on to the next slide, I will briefly explain to you what these goals consist of. We are currently looking at a short-term goal of 1.5% annual average fuel efficiency improvement. Here we are on track very well because of newer aircraft models coming into service and also flying more economically and improving our operations. Then we have a midterm goal. Obviously here the ICAO MBM comes into play. We would like to be carbon neutral from 2020. And then we have a very ambitious long-term goal, which is to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2050. So basically, to address and to fulfill these goals, we have to have obviously some good measures in place. And here the basket of measures, or we call it the 4 pillars of climate action, coming into play to achieve those goals. Obviously, technology is important, new aircraft, engines, etc. Operations is very important for us to reduce weight, for example, in the air. Infrastructure, here governments can help us to improve. And last but not least, that's why we're discussing this today. Those are the market-based measures that basically are important for us to reach our goals. If you go to the next slide, you will see a representation of the different contributing factors and how they will address the issue of carbon neutrality. And you see the dotted line basically indicates where we would be going without any action if we would continue business as usual. And then you have different wedges. The green wedges, for example, one of those wedges are representing the biofuels. The blue one, for example, that we already using and will be using in the future, but also technology improvements. The wedge that I would like you to focus on is the orange wedge, which is the market-based measure wedge. And here, obviously, in order for us to reach carbon neutrality, we need to have some measures in place. And in this case, carbon reduction units that will help us in the future to reach this carbon neutral goal. In terms of emission reductions and REDD+, if you move on to the next slide, in fact, aviation is already using emission reductions quite extensively, whether it be on a voluntary or on a mandatory side. We know of more than 50 airlines, in fact, have implemented their own voluntary carbon offset programs. I have to also admit there's different rates of success depending on how this program is implemented and projects being used. This can lead to a higher or lower success rate. Nevertheless, aviation is in the focus of NGOs, governments, consumers, more and more. But also we noticed something on the business travel side, so large corporations demanding from airlines more and more to have offset functionalities and to make use of carbon credits to neutralize their carbon footprint. IATA obviously has to play also a role, and if you look at the next slide, you will see that IATA has implemented an industry carbon offset program, which came up with a set of best practices in terms of how such a program on a voluntary basis should be implemented. We have more than 20 airlines that signed up to the program. TAP Air Portugal was a very good example of having implemented a very successful program, winning the UNESCO Planet Earth Award already in 2010. And we offering to our airlines large geographic coverage in terms of the projects, social economic benefits for local community, etc. But always also then everything that comes with it on the technical side, for example, the carbon calculator. If you move to the next slide, you will see that we invest in a wide range of projects, renewable projects, the LifeStore project that many of you probably know, solar heater project, cookstove projects, REDD projects. In fact, we are very proud in IATA that we support airlines that in fact invest in REDD Plus project, and more these projects are, we can see there's a shift actually going on, because they're considered by passengers as charismatic projects. In terms of the standards, we would, in that set of best practices that we have developed, include the known standards such as the ACDM, VCS, Gold Standard, but also others. Some of the characteristics that we have developed for voluntary carbon offsetting, if we move on to the next slide, we would typically make use of high quality carbon credits, CORs, VORs, from the standards mentioned, but also we would exclude some of the projects where we believe they're not sustainable in the long term. So, for example, HFC projects, large dam flaring nuclear projects. Again, we have the advantage if we help airlines sourcing credits that we can pool demand and obviously also get a good price for those credits. And as a general, for our voluntary program, as a general remark, we wouldn't put any markup or profits on those credits. So now talking about the role of REDD Plus in aviation, if we move on to the next slide, I think I mentioned it before, we can clearly see a shift in terms of demand from typical renewable projects to REDD, because they have a story to tell very often. And the value and core benefits that those projects offer, of course, are of great interest in the public. And also we can see there is the potential to provide large volumes in the future. We also have to deal, of course, with maybe criticism. There's some divided opinion in terms of leakage and permanence. And David has already addressed this, and I think there is very good ways, in fact, to address these issues. And so for us, this is not of great concern, in fact. If you move on to the next slide, REDD Plus in the context of a future GMBM, or global market-based measure. So the aviation industry in general would like to have access to as wide range of offsets as possible, but with the important caveat that we should meet certain environmental criteria. And here again, there's different groups under ICAO discussing the environmental integrity criteria, and those are all experts and parts participating from different from the civil society, NGOs, etc. Well, yes, for the last 3 years, CAPE has been defined these criteria. For us, it's important that these criteria exist, because we want to make sure that those offsets do actually reduce CO2 emissions in a meaningful way, but also there are possibilities that all airlines purchasing the same quality, and also maybe to a similar cost. One thing that we would like to avoid with this is, of course, market distortion between airlines. Well, in any case, it's not really in our long-term interest for airlines to buy cheap junk carbon credits, if I could say that.
Michael, I have to ask you to finish in a moment, if that's all right.
I will. But it's also important not to be restrictive when it comes to the type of offsets. So we have to, it's a fine line, a balance between the environmental integrity, cost effectiveness, and geographical scope in that sense. So if you move on to the next slide, for us, it is really a realistic plan to address climate change with the inclusion of REDD Plus. There are important economic incentives for the forest conservation. REDD forestry have to play a role with deforestation contributing around 20% of man-made CO2 emissions. Again, those offsets should meet the high-quality criteria, and we agree, I think, with many of the environmental NGOs that any realistic plan to address the worst effects from climate change should involve, in fact, the preservation of tropical rainforest for this, yeah. So basically, if we move on to the last slide, we as aviation, we supporting the inclusion of REDD Plus, and I think it's important that we also understand we're not only looking at the jurisdictional REDD under the under UNFCCC, but also the project-based REDD that's already basically existing and can provide a supply of REDD credits. And here again, we as aviation sector recommend the adoption of assessment criteria, and it's the typical ones that probably most of you are familiar, that they should be additional, quantifiable, should be monitored, and there should be a clear and transparent chain of custody, that those emissions are permanent. And I think that's something that also come up quite a lot during the discussion at ICAO level. There's no double counting, and they only counted once towards a mitigation. I think that really sums it up in a nutshell. Our current involvement and future involvement in the REDD arena. Thank you.
Michael, that's great. Thank you very much. So before we open up to Q&A, let me turn for brief comments to two others from their different perspectives. First, I'm going to turn to Andrew Mitchell, who's the CEO of the think tank, the Global Canopy Program. Andrew, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Just to introduce myself, I'm the founder of the Global Canopy Program, which is an NGO based in Oxford. We've been working on climate and forest issues for the last 15 years, and I've been to more COPs than I care to want to go to anymore to try and get REDD included in the climate mechanism. And of course, it was in Paris, so that was a big success. And that's, in a sense, the first point to make here, is that REDD Plus is not a newfangled mechanism that's just been cooked up by a bunch of NGOs. This is now something that has been approved under the process with the Warsaw Agreement. There is a kind of a rule book, and over 190 countries have, in a sense, approved the REDD Plus mechanism, at least the overarching framework for it. So there is a kind of framework under which this should operate at an international level, and REDD Plus is one of the most advanced parts of the climate discussion that's gone on under the UNFCCC. Quite well worked out. So there should be no doubt that there is support for it intergovernmentally, and that the mechanism is clear. The detail, however, it gets more complicated, and we've heard some of that today, and I won't repeat it all, to do with permanence and so on. And the other point is that the airline industry is set for growth. We're looking at something like 56,000 new aircraft in the next 25 years. So how do you deal with that in terms of an emissions problem when we've heard the approach? It's inevitable that some kind of offset mechanism will have to play a large part in neutralizing these emissions into the atmosphere. You either have to stop people flying or make the planes much more efficient, and neither of those are going to be able to solve the whole of the problem. The figures we put out in our paper, which has already been mentioned, linking forests and flight, were that about 7.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide would need to be mitigated between 2020 and 2040. That's a very large amount of offsets. And one of the good things is that REDD Plus has the capacity to achieve a lot of supply. We've heard there's maybe some constraints on that, but it's very likely that if we can get REDD Plus to really start flowing, that it can meet much of the demand that the airline industry is looking for. And so we created a coalition of 9 leading NGOs, and these are some of the largest in the world, such as Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, to advocate that REDD Plus was a good idea for the airline industry, and to work with the airline industry to help make this work. The decision we're really looking for here is that in October, when the mechanism is agreed, that REDD Plus should be on the menu and not excluded. And I think there's a lot of support for that growing now. There has been some criticism. Other NGOs take different views. That always happens in this situation. We're there to try and provide a supportive view. And I think there's a huge opportunity here for REDD Plus to be included, and then the details have to be worked out after that. We shouldn't get the cart before the horse and allow the details to get in the way of agreeing the principle that REDD Plus has a huge role to play in the offset mechanism. we've already heard that REDD Plus is quite different from other kinds of offsets, and the reason is very simple. That is because forest credits are alive. The carbon is alive, whereas all other offsets, the carbon is dead. Therefore, you don't get any additional benefits as you do with forest credits. So forest credits offer huge additional benefits in terms of water, food, energy, and livelihood security over and above climate security alone. And other credits don't offer that. So that's why forest credits are so special. Also, the amount of mitigation, if we were actually going to reach 2 degrees or even 1.5, we won't achieve this unless we stop tropical deforestation going on around the world. And if we do stop it, if you take account of reducing the emissions from forests, maintaining forests, replanting forests, managing landscapes better, the opportunity to mitigate carbon emissions and get goal is huge. It's probably at least 30% or more what we can do over the next 20 to 30 years.
Andrew?
So that's important. So for these reasons, I think, I feel that it's a really good match, and that we're looking at, in a sense, the environmental deal of the century, if we can make this all work. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. So last but not least, let me turn to Edith Kiss from Althelia for an investor's point of view. Edith.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Richard, and hello, everybody. So from Althelia's perspective, we are a public-private impact investment fund. But I'm also, so we'll speak a little bit from the broader investor community perspective. Although it will be quite difficult to add because all the arguments have been already well put through the other speakers. So I can just echo their views, but we'll try to add some more. Basically, from the investors' community's perspective, we believe that it's a win-win situation for the aviation sector, allowing REDD Plus credits in the global market-based mechanism. And with CMIA, we have published a paper on this. If you're interested to read more, you're welcome to download it from the website and read more. But basically, mostly, again, as it has been said, believe there is a good natural fit for the aviation sector with REDD Plus, because simply tropical forests represent probably the only possible bridging mechanism in the fossil fuel transition. And as Chris mentioned before, with the gap filler nature of the mechanism the aviation sector is looking at, it fits quite well. So we also believe that actually beyond just the aviation sector's role, ICAO holds an opportunity to be a role model for other sectors and to help build a global REDD Plus market, which would be a first in the market. And so why you might wonder why this is important. And again, back to Andrew's point, we really believe that for the aviation, but also a little bit broader, in a broader sense, for the whole fossil fuel, oil and gas sector, we have really they have really limited mitigation options on the short term, which also means that we as a society have limited options to avoid breaching the near-term carbon budget limits. Just to illustrate, from scientists say that to achieve a 75% likelihood of avoiding the global warming in excess of 2 degrees, the fossil fuel emissions should be eliminated in the next 20 years, which is clearly not realistic. However, if we take into account tropical forests, they could not only stabilize but also reduce the CO2 concentration in this time needed for the transition away. So again, it's clearly a very interesting bridging tool we have, but the time is key. We have been waiting for the UN to deliver this mechanism since 2007, so broadly in the last 8-10 years, and it's ready to go. Again, as Andrew has pointed out, this is probably the most advanced mechanism under the Paris Agreement. So we think it offers a great advantage in the sense that its prompt start is guaranteed. There is no learning by doing. We know what's coming. There is a lot to build on, an existing pipeline, expertise, etc. And it's also a quickest way to again, in this whole broader, more macro challenge for our planet, REDD Plus doesn't require any technological advancement. It's there. It just needs political will to be implemented, like we have seen in the example of Brazil. Fully sharing the views of the other speakers, David mentioned, I think, cost effectiveness, diversification. So we simply believe that, yeah, given also the uncertainty in post-2020 world in terms of the architecture, which is clearly not going to be like the Kyoto framework, we believe that it makes sense for the aviation sector to leave the door open to as broad access to broad type of credits. With the caveat, though, I would finish that we have seen, and investors have been burned in the past by too many failures of market-based mechanisms because the rules were not maybe set up correctly or optimally. So we would, I think, from an investor perspective, welcome to really emphasize that this has to be done correctly and raised to the bottom. In terms of pricing and environmental integrity is very important. So that can be done through setting a high minimum bar, the high minimum standards, safeguards for REDD Plus, maybe exclusions on other types like CRs, as was mentioned. But we hope that this will show a good example how a market mechanism can work, and other sectors will follow. So I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Edith, thanks very much for those comments. Sarah, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much to all the presenters for great perspectives and I think complementary views on this topic. And thanks to all of you for listening in and for submitting quite a few questions. And we've been keeping track. And in the time remaining for this webinar, I would like to put some of the questions we've received in writing to the participants. I'm aware that we probably have more questions compared to the time allocated, so I would encourage anyone who wants to follow up bilaterally to either contact the presenter or to liaise with one of the organisers, and we'll put you in touch with them. So if that's okay with you, I'm just going to put an overview of the questions received, and I will then give the floor back to all of our speakers for their responses and their concluding remarks. First question is linked to Chris Surgeon's comment that there would be no decision on REDD Plus at this year's General Assembly, but that this would be in 2017, 2018. Can you expand on this a little bit and why you don't expect any clarity later this year? We also received a few comments, maybe more directed to David, about the credibility of REDD Plus credits and why any projects that are not approved under the UNFCCC should be eligible and should be recognised. Is there not a risk of hot air projects being considered, in which case does that not put into question the long-term predictability and credibility, of what ICAO is currently negotiating? We also had another question about the Paris Agreement requiring carbon neutrality, and in light of that, what is the panel's view of the ambition that the aviation sector has set itself under the ICAO negotiations? Is it in tune with what the Paris Agreement requires? Another question more specifically linked to the jurisdictional REDD Plus projects, as there's a lot of support for those projects to be eligible for airlines. And there's questions here from one of the participants about how many jurisdictional REDD Plus projects exist, how long would it take for these to develop, and isn't the issue that is driving the focus of jurisdictional REDD more concern about double counting more than anything else? In which case the question to the panel is, are there ways to address double counting until a global accounting system is in place? Three last questions, and I'll be quick. What standards are used for REDD Plus? Does the airline industry have the intention to set up its own market or its own exchange? And finally, how to address the fact that many countries plan to keep reductions, such as REDD Plus reductions in their own countries to meet their own NDCs. And in that sense, how can the aviation sector use such REDD Plus credits without the problem of double counting? So there's a mix of questions there. I'm sorry to bombard you with these all in one go. I think the best way forward is just to talk to our speakers very briefly, because of time constraints. If you can just quickly respond to the questions that you think are most addressed to you. Maybe we'll start with you, Chris. You had a specific question linked to what we can expect from this year's General Assembly. And then I'll give the floor to David, Michael, Andrew, and Edith. Chris.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I didn't actually address my central question of can ICAO deliver on the scheme? And the answer basically is yes, but I don't think one should underestimate that there are still some sort of major obstacles to overcome. There still remains a clash of principles on whose responsibility it is to address fast-growing international aviation emissions and how that responsibility should be divided up. But I think it's clear that ICAO and industry insiders appear confident that a deal can be done, but probably we won't know until towards the end of the assembly. But I think this sort of answers the other question that you put to me about that there will have to be some questions that will have to be parked until an agreement is reached on the basic design elements of the scheme. And it's not just emissions unit criteria, but it also affects registries, MRV, and so on. And there's still a lot of work to be done on that. And nobody wants to underestimate the fact that, of course, we want environmental integrity to this. And this will have to be seriously considered. But as Michael has shown, there is a lot of goodwill towards REDD Plus within the airline industry. So you wouldn't think that there will be any problems about that. But I think one should also just recognise that after this scheme has come into fruition, then we'll sort of start thinking about things like REDD Plus in more detail.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Chris.
Could I chip in? It's Michael. I mean, I just wanted to add a few words to what Chris said, because I mean, we should not forget, first of all, such an agreement from a sector has never been existed before, or had never been attempted. So this is the first time a whole sector basically asking to be regulated, voluntarily asking to be regulated from the outside. So that's quite a unique case. If you look back at the high-level meeting that took place this year, I think the general mood was positive. We as a sector are very positive, and we have been asked many times, what happens if it doesn't come through? In fact, we don't have a plan B. We strongly believe this will be happening, and I think the signs are positive, and we believe very strongly that this will be happening. So there is no plan B for us. I mean, this is something that we really want to see implemented. And I think we have shown that we're supporting the discussion in that sense, and we believe it's going in the right direction. I mean, of course, the devil is in the detail, but some of the big issues, such as CBDR, phased implementation, I mean, those are obviously the sticky points for now. But I think we believe that those can be overcome, and finally we will see a positive outcome of this in September this year.
Okay, thank you for that perspective. Very helpful. Can I give the floor to David to take some of the questions?
Sure thing. Thank you, Sarah. Those were quite a few questions. Let me try to take them in order as they came in. The first one about the credibility of REDD and not being approved by the UNFCCC. I think in the long run, everybody sees that there probably will be some sort of UNFCCC framework, but it's not built, it's not designed yet, it's not operational, and we don't know when that will be done. But at the same time, I think there's a number of different programs out there that can deliver environmental integrity. I don't see any reason why that would preclude being able to use those programs. In many ways, I think the question might be kind of questioning the whole construct of what the MBM looks like. The MBM will accept credits from programs that meet the emissions unit criteria. And clearly one of those programs is the CDM or anything that the UN comes up with, but it does mean that organizations like us will be able to play a role and submit our applications, get recognized. So I don't see why it has to be only from UNFCCC-backed credits. The second question, or actually the question about what are the standards used for REDD+, there's a number of them. At the project level currently, you've got the CDM, VCS, the Gold Standard, the Climate Action Reserve, the American Carbon Registry, Plan Vivo. I think those are the main ones out there that generate credits for REDD+ activities. At the jurisdictional scale, you've got the methodological framework of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility of the World Bank that's moving ahead. We ourselves at the VCS have the jurisdictional nested REDD framework, which allows governments to develop REDD programs and to include individual projects within those. And to the first question, it looks like there will be some sort of UN mechanism in the future that will address and enable jurisdictions to deliver, but that one is not yet built. Today, the two ones that are operational are the VCS JNR and the FCPF of the World Bank. So that hopefully addresses the question about how many jurisdictional programs are there and how long it'll take to develop. I mean, these things are not easy. You can't just add water and expect them to flourish overnight. They tend to be very complicated. We developed ours over the course of several years with significant backing from the Climate and Land Use Alliance and then from funding from the Norwegian government to help implement and develop those programs, to pilot them. So it's been a labor of love and quite a long process. So these are not simple things that can be done overnight. So that's why we think that the decision by ICAO to leverage existing infrastructure and requirements and programs makes a lot of sense. And there was a question about double counting, which I think is worth describing and talking about. I think one really important, and the question I think was about, isn't the jurisdictional piece all about ensuring double counting? And I don't think it is. I think they're separate issues. They're both very important. And just to be clear here, what you get from a jurisdictional accounting of REDD is harmonized accounting across project level and jurisdictional level accounting, and so you get a comprehensive accounting of all the emission reductions. And I think importantly, you also get government involvement in this, which is what we all want. We all want governments to step up and address deforestation, and they can do that through comprehensive REDD accounting through jurisdictional programs. And I think that's the long-term view. Now we need to get there, and there's a road to travel, which we think needs to include a role for projects. And that's different than the double counting piece, which I think is critically important and will affect not just REDD credits, but credits from any sector, whether it's a landfill gas project, a renewable energy project, or whatever. Those credits will need to be accounted for by probably, we don't really know exactly what that will look like, but probably in the national account of the host country. So if you are going to export a credit to the aviation sector, which in this case can be counted on, say, as a separate country, if you will, those credits will need to be accounted for in the national account of the host country, and that will apply to any kind of credit. And I think whether those rules will be in place by 2020, that's an important consideration. Can anything be done before then? That remains to be debated and to be considered. What can be done to ensure that those credits are not double counted, or that there's double counting provisions prior to 2020? And I think that's one of the things that I would imagine will be, one of those discussions that will be had as part of the implementation of this, and hopefully some sort of pre-implementation phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for this detailed input. Maybe I can give the floor back very quickly to Michael, as we had a specific question about the plans of the airline industry and whether there was an intention at all to set up a sort of separate exchange or just a known market of, I suppose, aviation allowances or credits for the aviation sector. Are there any plans along these lines, or is that maybe too detailed for the time being?
Well, yes, maybe a bit premature, this question, before we even have an agreement in place and not even understanding which are the sort of the criteria and emission units that would be accepted under a future scheme. And nevertheless, there's capacity building going on, so we need to, and we're doing so, bring our airlines up to speed with the developments of the ICAO scheme. And that's our role as a global association, to support our members, making them understand and be prepared for anything that will be implemented in the future. We cannot do this alone. We need carbon market experts. We closely collaborate with IETA, for example, in that sense. I could imagine some joint work in the future where we do capacity building together with the airlines. And perhaps in the longer term future, I could imagine that we also play a role in the sense, maybe not an exchange, but that we, again, team up with experts in carbon markets and enabling those airlines that have not the means or the technology know-how and understanding, and that we can support them in the future with the sourcing of carbon credits and to facilitate that process. I could imagine that we play a facilitator role in that, and I think that's expected from us, just like we do in any other area, whether it be agency sales, where we act as an aggregator for the airlines, for all the sales worldwide that's happening. Obviously, it makes sense, and we have a clearinghouse. Our systems are linked with the airline systems when it comes to the financial settlement. So, I mean, we would not do anything single-handedly, I would think, because we are, again, we wouldn't have the expertise to do that. But I think this is sort of far off still. In the short term, it's really about capacity building, I would say, that we bring the airlines up to speed, make them understand, make them prepare. And again, we need input from the experts in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I'm really sorry, I know we're running out of time, but I would like to give the floor to both Andrew and Edith, if you've got further comments to some of the comments or the questions that were posed by the participants.
Edith, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to make some reflections on the questions around jurisdictional REDD projects. We are an investor in both the project and program level, and I can confirm, as David said, it's a quite different type too, and it takes a lot of time for programs, jurisdictional or national, to develop. There is quite a good pipeline under the FCPF, but is yet to materialize. We have seen Acre is the only state which is ready today in Brazil to sell credits, although the projects there haven't been nested yet. That is very interesting also for California. And for example, another country is Peru, which started the nesting process, and we anticipate that it will take a while. So just a point on that, I think in order to avoid a concentration of supply, what we have seen in maybe in the CDM with China and India, it's important to recognize the speed at which these programs develop, and hence again, the projects in a transitionary way, the role they can play also if we want to keep that geographical diversification we talked before about. So that would be just a point from my side.
Okay,
if I could.
This is Andrew. Just to make a final point from me, and I think probably two. I totally echo the question on the position on capacity building amongst the airlines. REDD and all that starts to sound very complicated to someone who's managing an airline, and so we need to do a lot of work, and I urge IATA to work with the experts, as I'm sure you are, to get the message out to the airlines that this stuff can work and is credible. The second thing is that many countries are standing by to develop projects. Some of you have said, well, how long will it take? Well, it won't happen at all unless there's demand, and today there isn't any demand. It's about 3% of the supply that could be available. So a signal from the airline industry that they're interested and this could happen will galvanize project developers and countries to really get behind REDD+. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that concluding remark, which I think is a good way to conclude today's webinar. There's still a lot to discuss, obviously, a lot of unknowns, and I think that we all recognize that the priority will be for an agreement to be reached in ICAO later this year at the General Assembly. And that a lot of the details, which will be very important details, will be worked out following this General Assembly. So I hope we can all keep in touch to discuss this. There are a few questions received in writing. I didn't have time to mention. Considering the use of REDD Plus as part of this mechanism. So maybe that's another aspect for us to look out for. We will be circulating the slides, and we have recorded this webinar so that anyone who wants to discuss this further or wants to look at some of the information that was highlighted will be able to do this. So we'll be circulating this to the participants, and it will be on our website as well. With that, we are, I think, 10 minutes past the allocated time. Thank you all very, very much for your participation. Thank you for the questions and for your patience in listening to all this, and a big thank you to all the panelists and the speakers, and to Richard Folland for co-chairing this webinar. So thanks all, and let's keep in touch.